This is the Chateau Lake Louise, and is Canada's crown jewel nestled amidst the Canadian Rockies along the Continental Divide. Originally built by the Canadian Pacific to lure wealthy travelers by rail to experience the jaw-dropping beauty of Lake Louise. In this video, I'm going to take you along my 2-night stay where the opulence and grandeur of over a century of history converge into a symphony of unforgettable experiences. From coffee and treats looking out on the glaciers of the Great Lake and surrounding vistas, which are actually one of the 7 wonders of the world, to the fire that almost destroyed all of it in 1924. This is the Chateau Lake Louise. Let's begin. Now this video was filmed in March of 2024, right after we had completed a 2-night stay inside Calgary's Palatial Palace and the castle in the city, the Palliser Hotel. And that was amazing and will be the focus of next week's episode. But here at the Chateau Lake Louise, we have to back it up well over a century and a half ago to tell this story from the start. It was 1880, and this was a pivotal era in Canadian history. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, had just championed the Canadian Pacific to build a coast-to-coast railway that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail. And in 1882, Canadian Pacific was mapping west of Banff when the young and adventurous Tom Wilson, this guy was guided by the Stony Creek First Nations up a lake to upon which when he arrived he entered in his journal, "With God as my judge, I have never in all my explorations seen such beauty." And Canadian Pacific's visionary Cornelius Van Horn wasted absolutely no time commissioning a cabin on the shores of Lake Louise upon hearing the discovery. So in 1883, the Canadian Pacific would build a fishing shack just on the banks of Lake Louise, but in 1893 it had burnt down, and the following summer in 1894, they would build a bigger, much stronger chalet in its place, dubbed the Chalet Lake Louise. And in 1886, Philip Abbott, who was thought to be one of North America's most experienced alpine climbers, led an expedition to conquer Mount Lefroy. But only feet away from the summit would fall to his death as he hit the frozen lake below, and this was the first recorded mountain climbing death in all of North America. And upon hearing the news, the Canadian Pacific began enlisting Swiss Alp climbing guides in an ambitious expansion to the Chalet, a new concrete wing that was a big shift from the style of the original Chalet and the rest of the Canadian Pacific hotels across the Rockies. And this wing was built between 1900 and 1912 and welcomed private balconies, which were pretty cutting edge at the time, and helping to further immerse guests in the luxury of the untouched beauty of Lake Louise. Now, Lake Louise is on a pretty steep incline up from the village, and by 1913, guests had been arriving on horse and buggy, which took about 90 minutes each way from the station. But in an attempt to innovate, the Canadian Pacific built a tram line from the station to arrive at the chateau, as you see here, cutting the commute time to 20 minutes each way. Now, July 3rd of 1924 was a pretty bad day at the chateau, because around 10 a.m. the entire wooden chalet burst into a flame, and although the staff were very quick to separate the blaze from the concrete wing despite the chalet being burnt to a crisp, this was a pivotal moment because 3 months later, in September of 1924, the Canadian Pacific broke ground on a new 9-story wing expansion, and in June of 1925 emerged a 400-room, new neo-Renaissance style hotel that we now know today as the Chateau Lake Louise. And 1926 actually saw the inception of the Lake Agnes Tea House atop the Big Beehive Trail for hikers looking for a hot cup of tea or joe after their hike, as well as the second largest pool in Canada at the time, which we will absolutely be revisiting a little bit more later on. Now, the Canadian Pacific's daily passenger service east and west into Lake Louise played an integral role growing tourism to the chateau. But in 1939, the chateau would close its doors until 1945 following the conclusion of World War II, and after the reopening of the hotel, guests were a lot more conservative with their money, despite the debut of Canadian Pacific's finest fleet in 1955, the Canadian. And the dawn of the 60s saw CP actually discussing selling, or even in some cases demolishing the chateau altogether. I know it's hard to believe thinking about things now, but back then, this was the state of the Canadian Pacific. But the late 60s and early 70s saw the explosive growth of downhill skiing, and in 1974 the chateau remained open year-round for the first time. And believe it or not, Lake Louise was actually a huge catalyst to attracting the 1988 Calgary Winter Olympics, and in 1979 the hotel would close for a $65 million renovation and would reopen just in time for the Olympics, with loads of passengers streaking from Calgary at the station just outside the Palliser Hotel, west on the Canadian, into Banff and Lake Louise to experience the glory of the Canadian Rockies and see for themselves why Lake Louise is regarded as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Now, less than 2 years after the conclusion of the Calgary Olympics, in 1990, the Canadian government would cut passenger service from Vancouver through Lake Louise and east into Banff and Calgary in what they described as a quote-unquote way to save Canadians money, despite the billions of tourist dollars that would evaporate overnight, with no tourists being able to experience Canada's crown jewel-filled lake or having access to Lake Louise via the train that built this area for over a century previously. And in 2001, Canadian Pacific bought Fairmont Hotels brand and would begin to rebrand all their hotels as Fairmont, now making the Chateau the Fairmont Chateau Lake Louise. And 23 years later, we flip the page from past to present, in my experience, at this Canadian Pacific icon along the Continental Divide of the Canadian Rockies. Now, it is worth mentioning though that the Chateau was under heavy construction during my visit, but we'll touch a bit more on that later, because Bella and I had just spent 2 nights at the Palliser Hotel in Calgary, and after a 2-hour drive from the foothills of Alberta, past the Kalanaskis mountain ranges and into the glorious Canadian Rocky Peaks, we would arrive at our destination here at the Chateau Lake Louise. And when we arrived, the sun had just started to hit the peaks of the Canadian Rockies, which this time of year is very rare, and we would get the car valeted, and upon stepping into the Chateau, we immediately could feel the opulence that surrounded us, from the breathtaking painting of Morant Lake to the magnificent chandelier overlooking each guest as they walk through a piece of history. You can immediately tell why this is one of Canada's most iconic landmarks. Now, we would walk by the gorgeous Lakeview Lounge, which, don't worry, we will be returning to shortly, but our room is on the 2nd floor, and because of my status with Fairmont, they ended up upgrading us to a lakeside view with a 1-king bed, and it was awesome. I mean, just take a look at how cool this is. And the first thing that we did after that was head outside to immerse ourselves in the beauty of the Rocky Peaks on the edge of Lake Louise from these Adirondack chairs outside the Chateau, knowing that this adventure had only just begun. And we would head back into the Chateau for a reservation at the Lakeview Lounge, which this is the same dining room that guests have dined at for over a century, with these larger-than-life windows framing an unparalleled view of Lake Louise. Now, Bella absolutely loves sweet treats, so we ended up getting some fresh coffee, and we opted for the warm pumpkin spice cake a la mode for a sweet finish. And the cake was warm, the toffee dust was great, and the cold vanilla ice cream was the perfect pairing. But if we did have one complaint, it was that it absolutely needed more ice cream, because we love ice cream. The Lakeview Lounge team and their service were absolutely outstanding.
And now word from today's video sponsor, Magicspoon. We all remember the breakfast cereals we loved as kids that were loaded with sugar. Magicspoon turns that flavor up to level 10 without a single gram of sugar, 4 grams of carbs, and 13 grams of protein. Magicspoon is the protein-packed, keto-friendly breakfast cereal I've been indulging in for years. Whether it's breaking my daily fast at noon or a late-night snack before bed, Magicspoon offers me the nutrition I love without sacrificing an ounce of flavor. Flavor is the spice of life, and although they have loads of flavors and specialty drops, their original fruity is my absolute go-to favorite and has been since day one. And right now, you can get $5 off my favorite breakfast cereal when you click the first link in the video description and use the code TRAV. It's my name, TRAV, for $5 off my favorite cereal. And thanks again to Magicspoon for sponsoring today's video.
And after that, it was off to bed for a relaxing night and a fun-packed day ahead of us tomorrow morning. We'll see you then. We're hiking the Fairview Trail, which Chateau's right here. Trail should be somewhere over there. At the first morning light, we were treated to an incredible Rocky Mountain sunrise. Now, Lake Louise is pretty remote, and there's not a lot to do here if you're not into the whole great outdoors thing, so we headed out first thing this morning for a hike down the Fairview Trail, but there are actually a few trails here, like the Big Beehive on the way to the Lake Agnes Tea House, as I mentioned earlier, but the only downside is that the tea house is only open in the peak of summer. But if you get a chance to hike it in the winter, I think it's just as beautiful. It'd be nice if the lakes were thawed, but it's definitely worth your time. And upon returning to the Chateau, we headed up to the 2nd floor lounge for a complimentary coffee to warm up, or at least try to, because the coffee machine was kind of broken. But on the bright side, the lounge is pet friendly, so Wally, our corgi here, came with us, and later we would head out down the Bow Valley Parkway for Morant's Curve. This fabled stretch of track was made famous by the lens of the legendary photographer Nicholas Morant in the 1950s. Nick was a specialty photographer for the Canadian Pacific Railway from 1929 until 1981, capturing stunning shots for Canadian Pacific to attract tourists into the heart of the Canadian Rockies. From here outside Castle Mountain, where he actually had his wife jerry rig a ladder on top of their car to get the higher vantage point, to the Stony Creek Bridge, to the most famous of them all, Morant's Curve. And although this curve has not seen a long distance passenger since January of 1990, this is the track that helped build the Canadian Rockies, and specifically passengers hopping off 10 minutes away at the Lake Louise station, which, interestingly enough, is now a barbecue joint, which I'm gonna have to try out sometime. When we got back to the Chateau later on, we discovered that Fairmont offers complimentary marshmallow roasting campfires every night for hotel guests. So we roasted some
delicious hot schmoes.
They're called s'mores, Buzz.
Right, of course.
And although Bella kept burning hers, I made sure that she got some perfectly toasted marshmallows so she could experience a great s'more, while the ever-tentative Wally was very eager to partake in the festivities, playing the role of diligent custodian, trying to clean up any graham cracker crumbs that he could find. This was a lot of fun, and I could only imagine how awesome this would be late at night in the summer, roasting a couple delicious schmoes. Now, maybe you're wondering if we ate any actual food while we were here, and we actually did. Now, our culinary experience here spanned from gourmet indulgence to humble fare. The Chateau Lake Louise, first off, is not for the budget-friendly traveler, so my burger and fries here was $32, and Bella's fish and chips was $28 at the burger bar downstairs. And it's kind of your run-of-the-mill frozen food, let alone the 8-ounce filet for $88. They also have a breakfast buffet downstairs with unlimited fresh pastries and my favorite, smoked salmon, and it's pretty awesome. But if you do want to save a couple bucks like us, we went into the Lake Louise Village and ate at this funky little ramen restaurant, and next door they have the Trailhead Cafe that offers some incredibly affordable, super filling sandwiches and treats. Later that night, after all those treats, I headed down to the hotel gym, and although the gym was a little bit small, they did have a decent selection of equipment to get a lift in, and after that, you know what time it is. Now the Chateau, like all the other Fairmont properties, is also pet friendly, so our custodian, Corgi, got the VIP treatment from his own personal bed to a custom water and food bowl, and upon checkout we learned that the hotel does offer unlimited complimentary treats to all four-legged guests, which we will definitely have to explore a bit more next time. Now, because the Chateau isn't a national park, they do charge additional tourist fees, resort fees, and a few other hidden fees, so just be aware of that upon check-in. But when you consider that this is a century-old hotel in a national park, I can understand why they charge what they do, and as I mentioned earlier, the Chateau was under heavy construction during our stay, and will be for the most of 2024 in preparation for their 100th anniversary next summer, including the return of the infamous hot pool from the 1950s, which at first I wondered, why does the Chateau need a pool? I mean, the hotel is literally on the lake, but I later learned that Lake Louise, because it's purely glacier-fed, rarely gets above freezing temperature even in the heat of July, so if they added a hot pool like you saw in last week's episode of the Banff Springs Hotel, I'm all for it, because it's one of the coolest things that I've experienced to date in all my Grand Railway Hotel visits. The Chateau has always been a place that I've dreamed about staying at, and I think that most people that know of it fantasize about experiencing exactly what I got to experience here. And as much as I wish we got to experience it in the peak season in the warmth of summer, if you want to save a few bucks like us, winter is just as beautiful, especially in the fall when the lake is still thawed. And although this is a story driven by Canada's most iconic hotels, whether it's here at the Chateau, at Canada's Castle in Banff, across the prairies of the Fort Garry in Winnipeg, or the Castle on the River in Saskatoon, this series, traveling across Canada to share the stories of its Grand Railway hotels, is my love letter to my country and the brave men that put it all on the line to map the West, build an ocean-to-ocean railway, and in next week's episode, it is all about the Palatial Palace in Calgary at the Palliser Hotel. And as we set sight on the next chapter in this journey and the new horizons and untold stories yet to be discovered, Belle and I are checking out of the Chateau Lake Louise, heading back home. I'd love to know what you think. Are you looking to stay at the Chateau Lake Louise? What do you think of my stay? Leave in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you in another Grand Railway Hotel in the next episode. I'll see you then.